A very warm welcome to members and friends. Bernadette, our Honorary Secretary, did you want to say a few opening words?
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm so pleased that you have all decided to come and share our space this afternoon. Just before we begin, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Mark Figueroa and Miss Maria Mutidjo to our session. But before we begin, please be respectful of all who are in attendance. Our space is a space of mutual respect. If you need to pose a question, we ask that you place this in the chat. We will be monitoring it and we'll allow our presenters to see what you would like to hear, what you would like to say. I'm asking also that we all rename ourselves. If you're unable to do so, you can send me a direct message so that I can do that for you so that we all know who is in attendance. Please rename using your first and last name. I will now hand over to our president, Dr. Elizabeth Pigou Dennis.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bernadette Worrell Johnson. And again, a welcome to our speakers, Professor Figueroa and Mrs. Mutidjo. Special welcome to our returning members who are coming to our first webinar since our AGM in February. And welcome to any friends and new persons who are coming to a Jamaican Historical Society webinar for the very first time. Our theme, which we proposed in 2020 and we agreed to continue with this year, is Decolonizing Jamaica's History, an Unfinished Project. With that theme, we remain sensitive to highlighting stories, events, sites, and people in Jamaican history, which may not yet have been told or told in a fulsome way or told from the points of view of the actors. We're especially concerned with uncovering topics which would have been hidden or distorted by previous worldviews in our society. Our sub-theme for today is gender, and we are uncovering the contributions of special women in Jamaican history. And so we warmly welcome our two presenters who will highlight the histories and contributions of two very special women in the fields of economics and education. So I think that is it for my welcome, and just encourage us all to have a good time. Stay within the protocols that Bernadette just expressed for us. And over back to you, Bernadette, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I will be introducing both our speakers and then the presentations will run behind each other. Each session, each talk will be approximately 20 minutes. I will give a 5-minute alert as well when there is a minute left. So our first presenter, Mrs. Maria Mithujo, obtained her Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of the West Indies, majoring in literature and minoring in history. She pursued her master's in educational leadership and management at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. She has been a teacher for over 17 years. She has taught English at Arden High School in Kingston and Fuse High School in Osaka, Japan, before joining the Convent of Mercy Academy Alpha in 2009. In addition to teaching, she serves as the school's Dean of the School of Culture and Communication. She believes wholeheartedly in the power of education to transform individuals and communities. Professor Mark Figueroa has been an honorary research fellow at the UWI Museum for the past 4 years, having retired after 43 years on staff at the UWI Mona, where he completed his undergraduate studies from 1968 to 1972. He has conducted wide-ranging research in areas that include political economy and the Jamaican electoral system, migration and Caribbean diaspora, sustainable development and environmental management, as well as economic development and public policy. His recent research on Ida Greaves brings together two of his main research areas of interest, in which, taken together, he has published 25 essays. They are the history of Caribbean economic ideas and gender and socioeconomic outcomes in the Caribbean. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Maria Mithujo. Please unmute. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here with the Jamaica Historical Society. I must admit that I feel a bit like the centurion who says to Christ, I'm not worthy to be under your roof for you to come to my house. But you know what? I share with you what I know, and I hope that it will contribute to to the larger discussion that is taking place within the Historical Society. So again, my name is Maria Mutidjo, and I am honored to be here with you this afternoon. And I will be speaking about Jessery. So here we go. So I first came to know the name Jessery because of the accomplishments of the primary school that was named in her honor. And I became curious about her unusual surname. Of course, I too have an unusual surname, Mutidjo. It's Indonesian. And the Muslim name of my father-in-law that became his surname when he became Catholic. So his surnames kind of, piqued my interest. I was piqued by this name, Rippol, because certainly it wasn't a typical British surname. So I guess my first question was she Jamaican? And certainly I told myself that it was a man. So I come to that conclusion just because of the name Jessi, it sounded like a boy's name. So was he rather a famous athlete or a statesman? And, more importantly, what exactly was the great contribution of this individual to Jamaica? Why a school was named in his honor? It was only when I became a teacher at Convent of Mercy Academy that the story of Jessi Rippol became clearer. And I guess the first shock was obviously that Jessi was not a man, but rather a remarkable Jamaican woman. My presentation today is entitled Action Fueled by Faith and Friendship, the story of Jessi Rippol. And it's interesting that we examine this figure, Jessi Rippol, in the context of this series, Decolonizing Jamaican History, an Unfinished Project. Because often the story of Jessi Rippol is subsumed in the larger story of the foreign Sisters of Mercy who came to Jamaica to support her work. So the Sisters of Mercy may be more familiar, to people rather than this particular individual, Jessi Rippol. Yet it is critical that we celebrate this woman, a lay Black Catholic Jamaican whose action set the foundation for an incredible work on this island. At this point, the body of information we have on Jessi Rippol is unfortunately limited. So indeed, this is an unfinished project, it is. But I'm encouraged that there are attempts that are being made by the Mercy Historical Center, which is being developed by the Sisters of Mercy at Alpha, to address this unfinished project, the story of Jessi Rippol. And so for this presentation, I have relied heavily on the work of Sister Mary Bernadette Little, entitled The Story of Alpha and the Sisters of Mercy in Jamaica. And I'm also grateful for the help of Reverend Peter Espude, who has a wealth of knowledge on the history of the Catholic Church in Jamaica. So thank you. So we begin. So we know that for political reasons, Catholicism was banned in Jamaica when the British conquered the island in 1655. And while the ban was lifted in 1791, and the number of Catholics on the island increased somewhat because of the refugees fleeing the Haitian Revolution, the Catholic population remained stubbornly small. And this was due in part because the church was really focused on preserving the faith of baptized Catholics. Theirs was not the mission of evangelization and conversion. It was preservation. We're working with who we have. We don't need to get bigger. I mean, we could argue that that's still a symptom of the Catholic Church in Jamaica today, but that was their focus. But it is from this minority group that we get this figure, Jessery Rippol, Mary Ann Justina Rippol, was from this small group. So her mother was Mary Antoinette Roberts, and she was from Guadeloupe. So they have very similar names. And of course, Guadeloupe had a very rich Catholic tradition, and her father was Bernard Rippol, a Jamaican Catholic. And they married in 1835 at St. Patrick's Cathedral on High Holborn Street. And Mary Ann Justina Rippol was born in 1852, and she was one of 5 children. So that's just a little bit about the family that she came from. And this whole business of religion and faith becomes very, very important, not only in her upbringing, but in the direction of her life. So she was a devout Catholic, and her family worshipped at Holy Trinity Cathedral, which was then located on Duke Street. But more importantly, she was a member of the Ladies' Sodality. And the Sodality was really a group of women devoted to, one, the Virgin Mary, and she was named Mary too, and also prayer and fellowship, and the spiritual and corporal works of mercy, which include, among other things, feeding the poor, giving drink to the thirsty, and sheltering the homeless. So this was a real focus of this group that she was a part of. How do we reach out to those beyond us? How do we help? How do we minister to these people, but not doing it alone, but doing it within a group, and all of them women, right? And I focus on these details because the work that she undertook was directly influenced by the faith orientation towards uplifting the marginalized in society, whose plight in the second half of the 19th century was glaringly obvious. The full emancipation of the enslaved, as we know, in 1838, did very little to change the social, political, and economic standing of the formerly enslaved population. And the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, when Jessery Rippol was 13 years old, was in large part due to the unlivable and heavily taxed wages paid to them. And Tindagaru Kayo gives a good example of the impact of the unjust wage structure on the growth of Kingston's population, and he writes, being unemployed and unable to obtain good cultivatable land for subsistence farming, a good number of former slaves either captured idle land and squatted on it, or migrated to urban centers in search of employment. Relating to the latter, for example, the population of Kingston during a 10-year period between 1881 and 1891 increased by 25.7%. So, though the exact nature of Bernard Rippol is not known, or the nature of his work rather, the profession, what he did exactly, we don't know, I think that we can rightly assume that being a family of mixed race, and they were of African, Portuguese, and French ancestry, they were in a significantly better position economically than those around them. So although their children were largely shielded from the hardships experienced by the majority of the Jamaican population. So that would include Jessery Rippol. However, her involvement as a member of the Sodality allowed her to witness firsthand the desperate poverty of the people of Kingston, who lived in poorly constructed structures in cramped, unsanitary yards. And the contrast between the comforts of her own home and the dwellings of these people must have been stark. However, rather than being repulsed by the squalid conditions of these people, she became even more committed to helping them through the work of the Sodality, where she served as the secretary. And Father Osborne noted that in the secretary's house, A room was reserved, which came to be known as a poor relief station, where supplies collected by begging were kept, and from there they were distributed systematically by the committee of the districts. High on the agenda were orphan children. So let's remember that Jessery is a secretary, and the home that these things are being stored in is her house. And this particular detail struck me. It struck me because I thought, if an entire room in your house was filled with supplies for the poor, it was near impossible for her not to think of the precarious existence of the people on a daily basis. It was literally in her face. And she realized too that there was a tremendous need that needed to be addressed. This was not merely a hobby, a club that she was a part of, but a work or a mission that she had fully embraced, and she had an earnest desire to see the work grow. You know, often when we want to do things, we think that we can do it by ourselves, or we don't want to wait on anybody. We want to just go ahead and do it. So this can be a great temptation. But I think she always realized that there was power in working with others. There was power in friendship, and that friendship, that bond could go ahead and, you know, transform a situation. These women in the society were not just co-workers, they were friends. They were united by their deep faith and boundless passion to serve the poor. And we see later that some of them remained together even until death. You know, they joined the same community, the Sisters of Mercy. And she was always deeply connected to the community whose generosity supported her mission. So friendship was important. Maintaining these friendships was important because without them, she realized that she would not have been able to do the work that she did. Soon the desire to serve the orphans moved beyond collecting and distributing, which is what they did in the sodality. And the women wanted to do something more, something that was lasting and meaningful, something that would create change for these orphans who had absolutely no one to care for them. And so their solution was an orphanage. Hey, why not? They don't have anywhere to live, they don't have any mother, they don't have any father. Let's build an orphanage. Let's take them in and let's care for them. But it's important to note here that their action was not simply a deepening of a philanthropic effort, but at all times, the women sought the approval of the local church. They were always, you know, looking for that support and for that encouragement, for that approval. So, unsurprisingly, it was only after the petition to start the orphanage was approved by the vicar apostolic at the time, who was Reverend Thomas Porter. And after that, concrete steps were taken to find a location for the orphanage. In fact, it was Father Porter who asked the women to visit the 40-acre property on South Camp Road with a 5-bedroom cottage to see if it would be suitable for them and for the work that they planned to do. And in fact, it was. And they decided, you know, to take the first steps to move to the orphanage. But before that, they had to buy the place, which now is a struggle. Remember, these are women in the 1880s, and you know, they had been working with the sodality. They didn't have any job, but they had the support of their family. The property would cost £800 today. I did a little, you know, Google to find out what that would be today. It was $20.6 million today, which I think is very reasonable. Think about the apartments going up for sale in Kingston. Cannot afford, but anyway, we continue. So her personal commitment to the undertaking was evident from her own personal contribution that she got from family. Somebody saying quite reasonable, yes, very reasonable. 40 acres, very reasonable. And so she contributed £300 from her own, you know, from her own money. And then £500, the other £500 was raised from friends and also from Father Porter, who bought the property in his name. So the property was not registered to the Sisters of Mercy for a very, very long time. In May 1880, 27 years old, Jessie Rippol, along with an orphan girl, went to live at the cottage, and they called it Alpha. And she was later joined by Josephine Jimenez and Louise Dugal. In a sense, these three women became an indigenous Catholic order or religious congregation. And inspired by the work they were doing, other women came to join them. Jessie Rippol served as their religious superior, and Father Porter served as their spiritual director and counsel. However, Father Porter recognized that an affiliation with an established order would give the work a greater sense of legitimacy. But he was cautious in his hope of them actually being able to join an order. It would be fair to say at this point that the religious orders of the day were white organizations, and these were Black women. So, although he was hopeful and he wanted to be encouraged, he was also aware of the reality that existed within the church, racism. And so he wasn't too sure, if these women would be embraced by these foreign congregations. So though these congregations could embrace the idea of extending charity to those of African descent, the idea of Africans or people of African descent actually joining their ranks was less accepted in the 1880s. So from 1880 to 1888, when he died, Father Porter had desperately tried to attract an order to work alongside the women at Alpha, yet all his efforts were proven futile. However, supported by the donations and industry of Jessi and her companions, the orphanage continued to operate. And this period of Alpha is a very difficult one. The women could have easily become overwhelmed by the endless demands of caring for the children and the pressure of constantly having to fund this mission, but they remain undaunted in the face of these obstacles. And of course, it's always a leader who has to kind of maintain the focus and to encourage the troops. And that person was none other than Rippol. So what did they do? They planted and sold vegetables, hired men to cut the grass and chop wood, which was also sold. And the girls who had come under their care were also taught how to weave hats, which became a product which they could sell. And at the same time, the girls were able to acquire a skill because, they would eventually have to leave the orphanage. And so this is a skill that they could have that could potentially be used to support themselves. So after the death of Father Porter, Bishop Charles Gordon, a Jesuit, was appointed to Jamaica, and supporting the work of the sisters became one of his top priorities. So, one of the things that strikes me, and between these religious congregations and bishops, often there can be tension. But Rippol was always open to building a friendship and a connection. And I think this helped her to further the mission, always maintaining good relationships. And I think that's a lesson that, any of us can take today. It's important to maintain good relationships. And she certainly did. So when he came and he saw the good work that she was doing, and, he saw the influence that this could make on Jamaica and on the church in Jamaica, he was very eager to help her. One of the things too that he does in the meantime is that he helped the sisters to get a government grant, and through the grant they were able to open an industrial school for boys and girls. Also, they were able to build a new dormitory, and they started a laundry, which was also another income stream. However, through all this activity, the bishop remained focused on finding a community of religious sisters who would support Rippol. And so he sought the assistance of Reverend Paul Chandlerly, his friend based in England, on this mission. And thankfully, their efforts were met with greater success. The Sisters of Mercy, based in Bermondsey, agreed to come on mission to Jamaica and to train these women, Rippol and her companions. And on December 12, 1890, the four Sisters of Mercy arrived in Jamaica, and their welcoming party included the bishop, of course, and Rippol, who was at that time being called Sister Jessi. So they really felt like a congregation, although they didn't have the stamp of a papal stamp. They really felt that they were together. So, the sisters joined, and they had already started calling her Sister Jessi. The Sisters of Mercy, with their established structure and the focus they brought to education, would go on to play a significant role in the growth of the mission birthed by Rippol. But we must never forget that their success was due in part to the work that had been done by Rippol and the practical support that she and the Creole sisters, as they were called, Creole sisters, gave to them. And this was clearly seen in their first attempts in education. It was difficult at first to teach the children because of the language barrier that existed between the sisters and the children. But with the help of the Creole sisters, Rippol included, they were able to overcome this. And also their understanding of Jamaican culture and people was also deepened, and they were able to do better work because of the support of these Jamaican sisters who had not yet been absorbed into the Sisters of Mercy. But in February 1891, only a few months after their arrival, Jessery was made her first professional vows and became a member of the Sisters of Mercy. And this moment was historic because it was exciting in the Jamaican church to see a Jamaican woman entering this religious congregation. And she assumed the name Sister Mary Peter Claver, again, telling of her mission, because St. Peter Claver was a Catholic. He was a Jesuit priest, a Catholic saint, but he was known predominantly for his work with the enslaved in Colombia. And I'm sure it resonated with Rippol, that here in Jamaica, with its population, predominantly descendants of those who had been enslaved, were still in need to hear the word of God, but also to be cared for by the people of God because they were children of God. And so during her time with the community, there are several institutions that are established and which continue today. So we have the Alpha Boys School, which now goes by the name of the Alpha Institute. We have Alpha Primary School, Convent of Mercy Academy, Alpha. We have Alpha Infant and Holy Family. These are still schools that continue. So the immense contribution of Jessery Rippol to the establishment of the Mercy community cannot be underscored. But she never, unfortunately, assumed a position of leadership within the community. Sister Bernadette writes, the leadership of these communities was not homegrown, but imported from Great Britain or the USA. This is subtly written, but the message is clear. It was determined that the leadership of these communities should be white. And she writes, as one looks back on the early years, one finds instances where the counsel of Jessery Rippol was sought, especially in matters of health and temporalities. But she was never at the forefront to lead this group of sisters, of which she became a member, although her gifts and business acumen were recognized when she was numbered among the 4 discreet with responsibility for money and business transactions of the community. She could have been deterred by the strain of racism that existed, but she remained focused on the mission until the very end. And she died in 1830. Jessery Rippol died in 1949, rather, at 97 years old. She was buried at Calvary Cemetery. Sister Bernadette later writes that in Jessery Rippol we see someone attentive to the voice, a voice of the spirit deep within her, turning away from a life of comfort, ease, and selfish gain to expose in less dramatic, perhaps no less effective or real, to lift the plight of the neglected and downtrodden in the land, in a work that has stood the test of time and still continues to bear fruit in the 21st century. And I end this presentation with this anecdote from Sister Bernadette, who met Sister Peter Claver, as she went to be known as a novice. So the novices at the convent were called caps because of the headgear they wore, and Mother Claver would always call to them. Then in her 90s, she was not part of the day-to-day activities of the school, but she was always curious to find out what was going on and was eager to encourage the novices in their vocation. And after a conversation, she would usually give the novices a mint. And so when Sister Benny went, she would always say, go and take a mint. And Sister Mary Pascal, Jessery Rippol, Peter Claver rather, Jessery Rippol recognized that she wasn't taking the sweets. And she said to her, listen, it's important to receive gifts. It's important to receive gifts. And I think Jessery Rippol's life is a reflection of the beauty of being open to freely receive. She was open to receive all the graces that came with her faith. She was open to receive the gifts of friendship that ultimately helped her to fulfill her mission, which she earnestly believed God has called her to. And for her openness to receive, but also for her overwhelming desire to share what she had, she created the legacy that is Alpha and the Sisters of Mercy in Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right, so we're gonna just move over to Professor Figueroa, you're free to share your screen as well. Please unmute. All right,
Hello, can you hear
we're
me?
seeing, yes, we're hearing you and we're seeing your screen, so you can go ahead and enter your slideshow.
Okay, thank you very much. And my presentation is very different, but I'm always happy to be associated with Alpha, where my father went to school, and where on occasion I've tried to raise funds for their boys' band, which is such a great contribution to Jamaica. That's another story. I regret that I will have to go over some of my slides quickly to stay within my time. For this, I apologize, but you can always take a screenshot and question me later. My topic today is Ida Greaves and the Gender Transformation of Economics at the University of the West Indies, Mona, and you will see how it unfolds. It brings together two of my interests, as you have heard. One is the history of economics in the Caribbean. The other is the dynamics of Caribbean gender transformations. And in it, there's one repeating insight, which we saw in the last presentation, which is that much of what we take for granted is simply untrue. And learning about Ida Greaves, just like Jessery illustrates this quite well. In considering the gender transformation of economics at Mona, I first provide data illustrating that economics remains a very gender discipline. I then consider the gender transformation that has taken place at Mona, starting from the present and going back to the founding of the department in 1955. Next, I take a slightly longer view of the development of economics in the Caribbean, Commonwealth Caribbean and its diaspora. This provides a context within which to place Ida Greaves as a pioneer, following which I reflect on Ida Greaves and the gender transformation. In my presentation, I distinguish between sex and gender. I therefore use the term gendered. Similarly, I use the term racialized rather than race. And in an analogous manner, I use class and nation. The gender structure in the Caribbean does not always match those present elsewhere, but it's convenient to use data from the USA, which is often seen as the headquarters of economics as a discipline. In the left half of the graph, which covers the years from 2001 to 2009, we can see that all the lines are generally moving upwards, despite some bumps along the way. This shows that the share of PhDs awarded to women, represented by the top line, increased during the period. The lines below also indicate from top to bottom increases in assistant, associate, and full professorial appointments, where these correspond to the academic ranks of lecturer, senior lecturer, and professor used at Mona. In the second half of the graph, representing the period 2009 to 2017, we can see that the shares of PhDs going to women shows no clear increase, and that of assistant professors fell. If we consider the whole period from 2001 to 2017, we can conclude that a gender-neutral system would have produced over 30% assistants and associates, but the share ended up below 25%. For full professors, the share should have been above 25%, but it was below 15%. I make these projections based on the normal lag between graduation and appointment at different professorial levels. But economics is actually more gendered than this. These shortfalls suggest, as the issue as to why women only get 30% of the PhD has not been explored. In the next slide, you see two graphs which are not considered in detail. In 2002 and 2012, the share of women appointed as assistant and full professors was higher and rising more rapidly for sociology, psychology, and political science than for economics. Shares for economics, represented by the black lines at the bottom of the graph, are closer to chemistry, engineering, maths, physics, and computer science. while the lines representing the other social sciences are closer to the top half of the graph. Although not illustrated, we should take note of the other end of the gender spectrum. In the case of nursing, academic appointments for men moved from 4.7% to 7% between 2006 and 2016, although men would have represented approximately 10% of registered nurses at the time. Students entering the Department of Economics today face a different gendered reality than that which existed 65 years ago when the department started. For the second time in its history, a woman is the head of department. 3 of the 5 senior lecturers are women, 3 of the 7 lecturers are women, and 1 of the 2 assistant lecturers are women. Note that for this and all other staff counts that I give, I only include full-timers who are active in the department. Part-timers and those on leave or serving elsewhere are excluded. The department started in 1955 in the Faculty of Arts, now Humanities and Education, where the subject was offered within the BA general degree. The best evidence which I have suggests that the ratio of women to men taking economics was initially 40 to 60. It is possible that it then shifted more in favor of men, but for reasons which I do not have time to explain, the sources of data on graduates prior to 1973 is not reliable. What can be said with some confidence is the ratio of women to men has been reversed since 1973, where it stood at 38 to 62, whereas now it stands at 62 to 38. When the department started in 1955, it had 1 senior lecturer and 1 assistant lecturer, both gendered as male and both nationed as British. It was more than 15 years later that the first person gendered as female, Adlith Brown on the left, was appointed a lecturer. She graduated in the first BSc economics class in 1962, but took some time to complete her graduate studies. Meanwhile, her classmate, Norman Gervin, had returned to Mona 4 years before her. It took another 13 years to 1983 before there were 2 women employed at the level of assistant lecturer or above. But at the time, the department had doubled in size. It also took another 13 years until 1996 before there were again 2 women, and it was not until 2006 that there were 3 women appointed. Thereafter, more significant change began to take place. This included the employment of a man among the 4 administrative members of staff, a situation which has continued to the present, but which had only occurred once previously in the early 1990s, as far as I have been able to determine. 1996 is also significant, as it is the year in which a graduate of the department, gendered as female, Patricia McLean, was appointed a full professor at a university in the USA. No woman has yet been promoted to professor in economics at Mona. In contrast, 2 men who graduated from Mona have been promoted while working in the department, as have 5 other men who graduated from other universities. In other social science departments at Mona, women have been promoted starting in 1992 in Salices, then sociology in 2005, management studies 2015, and government in 2016. Economics was also the last discipline in which a woman was appointed head of department in 2018. Caribbean economics predates its academic manifestation, but time does not allow me to elaborate on this aspect of our history, which also needs to be decolonized. The colonial experience has left each of the subregions with its own history of economics. I only mentioned the Commonwealth Caribbean. Best known economist born in the Caribbean, W. Arthur Lewis, studied and later taught at the London School of Economics in 1930s. In 1979, he received the Nobel Memorial Prize for his work in development economics. He was the first person nationed as a West Indian to become principal of the University College of the West Indies, UCWI, and the first vice chancellor of UWI when it gained its independence in 1962. While principal, he served briefly as head of economics. He has cast a long shadow over Caribbean economics, and for many years it was taken for granted that he was the first Commonwealth Caribbean academic economist. While Lewis and others established a foundation for Commonwealth Caribbean economics mainly from outside, it was the Institute of Social and Economic Research, ISA, now the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, SALISIS, that played the most significant role within the sub-region. Dudley Huggins, its first director, was one of only 6 persons of acknowledged African heritage who obtained a PhD in economics from Harvard University prior to 1955. He was born in Nevis. Other economists appointed included Willie DeMast and Alfred Thorne, both born in Trinidad and Guyana respectively, and for a short time, Ida Greaves. Persons who were otherwise nationed included Carleen O'Loughlin, who in 1956 was the first economist gendered as female to receive a regular appointment at Mona. Women economists who worked on Caribbean national accounts, public finance, and trade were early visitors to ISA. These included Gisela Eisner, Phyllis Dean, Ursula Hicks, and Carrie Levitt. Arthur Lewis supervised Eisner and Dean and taught Levitt. Levitt in turn facilitated visits by various Caribbean economists to McGill University, including Willie DeMast, and she supervised Adlith Brown's PhD. Only in the last 10 years have the Caribbean origins of Ida Greaves come to be generally recognized. She was born in Barbados in 1907. That made her 8 years older than Lewis. And after graduating from McGill University with a master's in 1930, she completed her PhD at London School of Economics in 1934, 6 years ahead of Lewis. She had no long-term academic appointments, but she held short-term positions, and based on her teaching, research, and publication, we now recognize her as the first Commonwealth Caribbean academic economics of whom we have discovered. Ida Greaves published in high-prestige journals. Despite this, her work exemplified by the third listed 1950 study on monetary studies of the colonies was not as well received as that represented by the second on modern production among backward peoples, which established her as a pioneer in what later became known as development economics. Greaves deserves to be acknowledged for her contribution to the critical tradition in Caribbean economic thought. She presented many ideas which were later adopted by Lewis and which contributed to his fame. She also contributed to the ideas of the Caribbean Plantation School and was cited favorably by George Beckford, the most prominent member of the Jamaican member of that tendency. I have only time for short quotes from Greaves' publications. In her monograph, The Negro in Canada, she traces the history of deep-rooted and widespread discrimination against people of African heritage and concludes that, quote, learning to value other qualities more highly than mere skin color is an attribute that the white race may adopt with advantage, unquote. The title of her second monograph uses the term backward, drawn from the description used by the League of Nations for colonized peoples. She makes an ironic reference to the League's definition, which speaks to an inability, quote, to stand alone under the strenuous conditions of modern life, unquote. In keeping with the stand which she took against Eurocentrism, she points out that if these people, quote, were left alone, they would not find the conditions of life so strenuous. Ida Greaves was in many ways an enigma. Here we see the only picture which I have been able to find of her side by side with one of W. Arthur Lewis. These were taken at age 20 and 22 respectively. We have seen the kinds of positions she adopted regarding racism and Eurocentrism, yet she grew up among the Barbadian elite and was unambiguously ethno-European in heritage. Indeed, it appears that she was able to pass as British, as Phyllis Dean, mentioned above, expressed surprise to one of our British colleagues when informed that Greaves came from Barbados. It is ironic that the first academic economist of whom we are aware is a woman, that is in the Commonwealth Caribbean, given that the field has been so male-dominated. Yet this may not be such a big surprise, given where Greaves stood in the gender structure of Caribbean society. In the colonial Caribbean, Lewis was racialized as black and Greaves as white. Greaves could pass as British, and Lewis was seen as British West Indian. With the death of his father, Lewis's mother was struggling to hold on to the family's middle-class status by keeping shop while maintaining a job. Meanwhile, Greaves' father was accumulating capital and expanding his business activities. Greaves started out ahead of Lewis due to her racialized and classed positionalities. But in 1940s Britain, Lewis moved ahead despite his racialization. This was in part due to his gender advantage, as well as the network that he built based on his achievements. Greaves' academic achievements were seen as outstanding, while Lewis's were seen as exceptional. Lewis studied on an island scholarship. Sorry?
Professor, just giving you the 5-minute warning.
Thank you. Lewis studied on an island scholarship. He chose economics by default, as he wanted to be an engineer, but did not expect that he could find employment in that field. As he put it, he did not wish to be a teacher, lawyer, or pastor, which were the professions open to persons in his racialized group. Greaves appeared to have voluntarily studied economics and politics at her family's expense. Perhaps if she were gendered male, she would have had to do something more practical with a view to returning to mind the family business. Yet she too, like Lewis, may have had other ambitions which would have been difficult or impossible to achieve, as many professions were still restricted or just opening up for women when she was coming of age. It is notable that all the early economists gendered as female who were employed at or visited Mona were of unambiguously ethno-European heritage. There were also relatively more women economists coming to Mona prior to than post-independence. This was due in part, in fact, to the fact that there were relatively more women trained in economics prior to the 1939-1945 war than there were in its aftermath. It is also reflected in the relatively more limited access that women born in the West Indies had for higher education. The fall-off of the involvement of women in economics after the war may have in part been due to its increased use of mathematics, but it was also due to the privileging of former soldiers, by which you must read men, in higher education under the various laws which provided veterans with scholarships. Given that economics positioned itself as the physics of social science, it's not surprising that its gender transformation has been slower than other disciplines. Despite this, gender in Jamaica and its transitions have been distinctive than what has taken place in other countries. It appears that we may be on the cusp of a transition towards at minimum sex parity among Mona academic economists, Already 60% of student majors are women compared to less than 40% in the US. As with much of the gender transformation in the Caribbean, it has been driven by the opening of the education system. And where there have been women like Patricia McLean who have exercised agency to effectively manage their careers, changes have been more rapid. Research, which I have done on UWI and which has been done in other countries, show who get ahead in the academy and suggests that systems which take for granted the gender privileging of certain roles are transformed most slowly. Being in the right place and the right time is not enough. We have to make right decisions. In the discussion, perhaps we can consider those factors which tend to drive and those that tend to restrain such transitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you to both you and Maria. We will now hand over to Elizabeth.
I would like to say thanks to both of our presenters. I would ask Professor Figueroa, you can stop sharing screen now and mute your microphone for the time being, please, until we get a question. There is a kind of a feedback sound that might be coming from, okay, there we go. Okay, so if we get a question for you, we'd ask you to turn on back your microphone, and you can, if you wish, stop sharing screen, or we might want to just look at these ladies some more, because this is a rather important topic. Let's see what questions come up in the chat. There is one here now. How are these important pieces of history integrated to mainstream education, beginning at the primary education level? It doesn't specify who the question is directed to, so both of our presenters can take turns addressing. How are these important pieces of history integrated into mainstream education, beginning at the primary education level? Maria, you can unmute.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes. So, you know, I think forums like this are webinars like this a good step in that. You know, I read one of the comments. I never knew anything about her, and it's so true. You know, I think a big step starts with knowing. As had been mentioned in the introduction, I am a teacher at Convent of Mercy Academy, and one of the things that I think all the schools on that campus, which include Jessery and Alpha Infant, they're very intentional about introducing these figures, especially the figure of Jessery to the students so they are aware. And so within our small circle, we do it. But I think those who have the knowledge need to be intentional about spreading that knowledge, really and truly. Because if nobody knows, and if we don't take the steps to help people to know or make people aware of this history, then it will always be hidden. As I mentioned in the presentation as well, one of the things that the Sisters of Mercy are doing right now is creating this historical center on the campus of Alpha. And I think a big focus of that is going to be on the figure of Jessery, who, as I'd mentioned, often gets overlooked in the bigger story of the Sisters of Mercy. So I think that is one thing that is being done. But you know, as a community, a mercy community in Jamaica, these are steps that we can take. You know, we have to be very deliberate in sharing that. And I think if that doesn't happen, then we can't really see that it's going to come into, you know, to the mainstream or into classrooms. And also, you know, even as this presentation focused on the role of women, you know, so often women are kind of overlooked in history, and we know all of these male figures. But if we but I think there needs to be a greater focus within the Caribbean, within Caribbean history, to move beyond the story of Nanny, who everybody knows, to really look at other historical female figures that we can, broaden the discussion on, and figures that we can actually learn from, especially in the context today.
Thank you very much, Maria. Professor, you want to take a shot at that question too?
Yes, I think that this is one of the problems at universities. They talk to themselves, so that there's not sufficient exposure of research to the community. This is brand new research that I'm reporting to you here. Hasn't been reported before. Ida Greaves has only been, in a sense, rediscovered to some extent. Although one of my colleagues, a British woman by the name of Barbara Ingham, has done a lot of work and is writing a book about her now. One initiative that I would draw your attention to is that the University Press has begun to put out a series of volumes about individuals such as names I won't remember, which is actually coordinated by one of my colleagues in Trinidad, former Dean of Humanities. And I know Marcus Garvey has been one of them, and I can't remember the names of the others for the moment, but I think that sort of initiative that takes what is complex academic research and break it down to the level where ordinary students in high school can read it and understand it. I think that is very important. And I think one of the things that the community that supports the university needs to press it to do is to develop a different profession, which is a profession that translates what is academic research into stuff that ordinary citizens can digest. To be fair to the historians at the University of the West Indies, they have done a lot of work in that regard, in the creation of the whole syllabi for West Indian history and the teaching of West Indian history. In that regard, there's a very famous West Indian woman by the name of Elsa Bavaya, a Guyanese woman, one of the first women to be employed at Mona, who did a lot of work in that regard, but also people like Roy Auger and Douglas Hall and others. But I think that it is definitely part of an unfinished job, and the community needs to press the university and us researchers to be more communicative. But of course, not all researchers can communicate with ordinary people, so you need another layer of professional who can really translate what is original research into stuff that is helpful for ordinary citizens and especially for young children.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question there specifically for Maria. It's thanking you for your presentation and saying that you mentioned that your sources were limited. Could you say a bit more about the sources you used for this presentation? Could you unmute yourself, Maria? And I'm going to ask Professor if he could mute his microphone at this point. Thank you.
Yes, so yes, my sources were very limited, but the main one that I used was a book. It's called You Did It Unto Me. This is how it looks. Huge book. And it was written by Sister Mary Bernadette Little. And she was also a sister. She was a Sister of Mercy, a Jamaican Sister of Mercy. And she made it her life's work. You know, this was her final project before she died, literally, to produce this book, You Did It Unto Me, the story of Alpha and the Sisters of Mercy. So that was the main text. So in preparation for this presentation, I kind of just had to, make my way through it, because the story of Jessi Rippol is kind of integrated into the larger story. So there isn't a text that's dedicated to her particular story and what she did. But this book was quite useful, and it does include a lot of facts, contextual facts about what was going on in Jamaica at the time, within the Catholic Church and just the wider community. So that was the main source that I used.
Oh, thank you for that. To answer to that question as well, I had reason for a different set of reasons to do some research recently on Alpha, mostly to do with the buildings. But of course, that came, the whole story of Jessi Rippol and all of that I found out. And there's my good old favorite resource, especially in these COVID times, is the Gleaner archives online. And there is a surprising amount of coverage on Alpha and about Jessi Rippol there. I don't know if you've used that, but that's a good resource. The Gleaner is. I mean, it is in its own way, its own unfinished project, but it's still, you know, the various editors, they still had an overall curiosity about all kinds of aspects of Jamaican society. So I find a lot of answers. And if it wasn't for that in these COVID times, I'm not sure how I would be able to function. So anybody who's interested, and you, Maria, could probably scan. We have another comment here. And I must say there are several comments commending our two presenters today. And we really have, in many cases, learned things that we didn't know, which is the whole objective of our unfinished project theme. So we have here Ida Greaves, another female. Is it Greaves or? Yeah, Greaves, another female figure I'm hearing of for the first time. So the person putting this mentions it's the first time. Also limits to the contribution of women in economics. Perhaps they need to employ and promote more women. Are more women studying economics? I think that's the burden of the question. Are more women studying economics in contemporary times? Professor? You can unmute.
Yes, as I pointed out, in fact, compared to many other countries, far more women are studying economics in Jamaica. Currently, we have, it's a 60 to 40 ratio female to male at UWI. And within the actual department, in terms of people who are actually in the department, working at the moment, it's like 50-50 too. And what I'm suggesting is we're at the cusp where it is likely that in the normal process of promotion, we would expect to see parity at this level. So that it's taken a long time, but I'm saying that certainly there's keen interest in economics now among women. And if you look on the board of directors of the Bank of Jamaica, and you're looking other places, you can see where the women are taking an interest in economics. We don't have a Minister of Finance yet, but we'll see where that goes next. So that there has been a change, especially in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I do have two questions of my own while waiting in case our guests add any more questions. One is for Maria, first of all. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but when I was doing my own readings about Jessi Rippol, and I was there going, hooray, 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 inside myself. And then I came to the part where it was Father Porter, I think it is, who actually did, you know, provide some of the opportunity and the support. And I thought, gosh, it still comes back to the patriarchy in the end. I notice you take a very optimistic view rather than a cynical view, but I want to ask you, how do you weigh that in terms of, obviously these ladies accomplished a lot, but could they have done that without those men? And as you mentioned, those overseas other women? So you can unmute again. Unmute.
I try. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Yes. So, it's funny because I was when I came to this topic, you know, the whole business of the land and the acquisition of the land, there are two views on it, you know. So one of the people who I spoke to, he was of the view that, listen, the sisters couldn't have bought the land without the help of Father Porter. He looks at Father Porter as one of the main investors in this acquisition, right? And so he contends that, you know, the women really didn't have enough money to buy it. And so it was Father Porter who had to kind of step in and help them in the supporting of that. The other view of that, which I got from a document that was from the Sisters of Mercy, was written in 1952, is in the archives of the sisters. And in that document, it doesn't have the property as 800 pounds. It has it as 400 pounds. And of the 400, it says that Rippol contributed 300 pounds, and then the ladies contributed the remaining 100 pounds. But still, Father Porter goes and buys a property. So there's a bit of a conflict about that around the figures and exactly who had the biggest parts in the portion that was given to acquire the land. But I think, you know, I think that a big part of it too was just wanting to make sure that they would always have the support of the church. I don't think that they wanted to go off and do it on their own, you know. I think they really wanted, not that they probably needed it because they could have continued the work, you know, on their own, but I think that they really wanted to include the church in it and to have the church's support in what they were doing. And so this is why Father Porter kind of reigns supreme, you know, his name reigns supreme in terms of you know, the whole foundation and the establishment of Alpha. I guess the other point as well is that and I guess this is where you see this racism in the church. Let's call it. I love my church. I'm Catholic. Love it to death. One Catholic and probably will die. But a fact is a fact. There is this strain there's this racist undercurrent in the church, especially at that time. And you know, there's a sense that if they don't have a bigger order, if they don't have an order that is recognized, then the work is not going to go anywhere. You know, I guess it's this lack of confidence that he has in what they're able to accomplish. And I don't know, you know, sometimes when people lack confidence in you, you kind of, you know, you probably, you know, take on the same attitude. Or maybe it would be better if somebody else comes and helps us. And they were looking for sisters to come for years, for 10 years. They were waiting for, you know, sisters to come and to finally make the decision to come to Jamaica to work with them. And in establishing this connection, because they're from here, they don't really have any connection with any other, you know, diocese or anything like that. They are heavily dependent on the bishop. Also, they trust the wisdom of the bishop in terms of what needs to be done. And so there's this need now to get this, you know, this foreign group to come and to kind of imbue them with this sense of legitimacy. So I think that's the role that the men in this story play. And I guess we could ask the question, if they were more confident in what they could do and just in terms of establishing a local order, because they had pretty much done so, would it just be a purely Jamaican story? Would it have that mix the same way? We don't know. But that's how it works out. The Sisters of Mercy from England come and they work with them and they do all these things. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and for sharing your reflections on that. The question I have for Professor Figueroa is, if I heard you right, did you mention that some of the ideas by either Greaves were adopted or adapted by Arthur Lewis? And if I heard correctly, what was it specifically that he took from her? What ideas and concepts were those? So you can unmute again, Prof.
Okay.
Good. You're still muted.
I'm unmuted now.
Good, this is okay
Yes,
now.
there's always a question when I have an idea and you come up with the idea later, whether you got the idea from me, which remains an outstanding issue. But there are a number of ideas that Ida Greaves had that Lewis later used. In the Caribbean, Lewis's best known article was written in 1950, and it speaks about the industrialization of the British West Indies. And it was rooted in the idea that agriculture alone could not support the population of the Caribbean. Alternative forms of employment needed to be found. And therefore it was rooted in the idea that the population, we were overpopulation. Ida Greaves had this idea. Lewis's most important rooted in the idea that there were areas in the world which were overpopulated, and as
we lost you, Prof, the audio. Is it only Prof we lost, or is everybody?
We lost him, so maybe we can move on to the next question. He's frozen, so I think we lost him.
Okay, what's that next question? Would it be from Maria? What's the other question, Bernadette?
I think you actually covered all the questions in the chat.
Okay. Does anybody have any last minute comment or question that they would like to bring up? Prof, are you back? You need to unmute.
sorry, I lost the internet for a second.
Yes, I realize. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm back. I was saying that basically the idea that Lewis had, in a sense, explains why China has been able to develop so rapidly in the last 40 years. And the core of that idea, Ida Greaves put forward that idea in her book, which I mentioned, on the backward peoples. So that there are a few key, and then the other idea that she had, which Lewis also had, Lewis drew a distinction in the development in how countries which were overpopulated, in quotes, as opposed to how countries were underpopulated should develop. His idea was that countries like Jamaica, India, and Egypt, which he mentioned specifically in 1954, should develop, were based on what is the way in which China developed, in terms of you bringing groups of capitalists who can form a pole of growth, sucking the excess population that cannot make a good living in agriculture, and you rapidly accumulate capital, and most importantly, that the local people learn how to do business. That was Lewis's idea for the overpopulated countries. For the underpopulated countries, and he advised the government of Ghana, he saw it very important to bring technology to the ordinary farmers, the small farmers, rapidly increase their productivity, in the case in Ghana, in cocoa, which would provide a surplus, which would bring about what he called an agricultural revolution, which would fuel an industrial revolution, which is how he saw the history of Britain. Again, Ida Greaves has this basic idea in her. So whether you went the path that he recommended for Ghana in 1953, or the path he recommended for the Caribbean in 1950, which we ignored, but which China ran with, and other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and before them, in a sense, Japan, before Lewis was writing. She had these basic ideas, not elaborated in the way in which he did, but the other thing she did, which he did, and this perhaps is her main achievement, she defended the view that the people of the colonized world were as capable of development as the people who colonized them. That there was nothing, in other words, this notion of backward peoples. There's nothing wrong with the people being backward. They were only backward in the sense that they were using technologies which were not as productive, but it didn't represent any lack of moral fiber, as Jessi Rippol demonstrates for us, or any will to improve their situation, as she demonstrated as well, and her friends. But it's just that they had to overcome their technological barriers if they were going to have the standard of living that the developed world had. So those were some of the ideas that she had, which contributed to development economics. But as to whether Lewis read her book and cribbed it, that's a different story.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to pretty much the end of our designated time, and we don't see any further questions, but be assured that there are many comments here that are commending the two presentations. I learned things today, and I'm sure everybody also learned something. We've looked at these two women in our Caribbean region who have contributed in somewhat different ways. One in the kind of higher levels of academia, and the other in a very hands-on way, with right down to putting supplies in our house and, you know, taking in children. So we see two different levels, two different methodologies in a way, but two wonderful contributions, two great stories that we have heard from our presenters today. So I think it now falls to me to give the vote of thanks as part of closing remarks. And I would like to thank Dr. Shani Roper, who is the first vice president in the Jamaican Historical Society, who did organize the speakers. She reached out and she organized this session, and very unfortunately was unable to be with us today. But I do thank her very much for being the main force in getting our two speakers with us today. I would like to thank Mrs. Nicole Prof, who's a member of our executive, and also could not be with us because of long meeting at the National Library where she works, but it was she who had the flyer put together for us. To thank the Honorary Secretary, Mrs. Bernadette Worrell Johnson, who has kept in touch with the members, sent out the notifications and so forth, and to all the members of the executive committee, because we all work together and we decide what kinds of things we want to do. Obviously, our greatest thanks are for the two presenters today who took the time out to share with us, Professor Figueroa and Mrs. Mutidjo. And thanks very much to our attendees. I want to point out to you that we have a website in the making. It is live. It is still being built out, but it does have provision for joining the Jamaican Historical Society. So if there's anyone here today who is not one of our actual members, you may want to join with us by going to the website www.jamaicanhistoricalsociety.org. I actually posted that in the chat. It's pretty easy to remember, just www.jamaicanhistoricalsociety.org, not .com. And through the membership portal, you can sign up, you can even pay for your membership or request payment details. And we are in the process of adding more content to that website. It's not an easy matter, but we are getting help pro bono from the School of Computing at University of Technology, Jamaica, for which we're very grateful for. We have a conference coming up in February 2022. So I'm just giving advance warning that you will soon see a call for proposals for abstracts for a conference that we hope to host in February 2022. And between now and then, we hope to have a couple more webinars. And who knows, maybe it's possible if a good many of us get vaccinated, we can do our beloved field trips in some shape or form before the year is out. How to see real places again and see real actual people. So we look forward to that.